If you've ever walked into a hardware store and picked up a SharkBite fitting, you probably had the same thought I did. There's no way this little push-on connector is as strong as a real soldered joint. And honestly, the internet is full of opinions on this one. Plumbers arguing back and forth, homeowners worried they made the wrong choice. But here's the thing. Most of those opinions aren't backed up by an actual test. So today, I'm going to make both connections right here, side by side, and then crank up the pressure until something breaks. We're going to find out once and for all which connection is actually stronger. And stick around to the end, because I've got a bonus tip about the one situation where SharkBite is actually the smarter choice, even if you know how to solder. This is one of the most common debates in home plumbing. And it matters because the connection method you choose affects the reliability of every joint in your house. The good news is both methods are easier to learn than most people think. And once you see the results of this test, you'll know exactly when to reach for each one. Let's start by understanding how these two connections actually work. Before we get into the hands-on part, it helps to know what's happening inside each fitting. With a solid joint, you're using heat to melt solder into the tiny gap between the copper pipe and the copper fitting. That melted solder gets drawn in by capillary action, and when it cools, it creates a metallurgical bond. Essentially, the pipe and fitting become one continuous piece of metal. That's why plumbers have trusted it for over 70 years. A SharkBite fitting works completely differently. Inside that green plastic body, there's a stainless steel grab ring with tiny teeth. When you push the pipe in, those teeth bite down and grip the outside of the copper. Behind that, there's an O-ring that creates the watertight seal. So you've got a mechanical grip holding the pipe in place and a rubber seal keeping the water from escaping. Two very different approaches to the same problem. Now let's gather what we need to test both of them properly. For the soldered connection, you're going to need a propane torch, lead-free solder, flux, a flux brush, and some emery cloth or sandpaper around 120 grit. You'll also need a tube cutter for clean cuts. I prefer the kind with the built-in reamer on the back, which saves you from needing a separate deburring tool. For pipe, we're using 1/2-inch type L copper for both tests, so everything is equal. For the SharkBite side, you really only need the fitting itself and a SharkBite depth gauge tool or a permanent marker to mark your insertion depth. That's one of the big selling points of push-fit connections. The tool list is almost nothing. You'll also want a SharkBite disconnect clip, which is that little horseshoe-shaped plastic piece that lets you remove the fitting if you need to. For the pressure test rig, I'm using a hand-operated pressure test pump, a couple of ball valves, a pressure gauge that reads up to at least 300 psi, and some short copper stubs to build the assembly. If you don't own a test pump, you can rent one from most tool rental places for about $20 a day. Now here's the step that makes or breaks both of these connections, and I cannot stress this enough. Pipe preparation is everything. I've seen soldered joints fail and SharkBite fittings leak, and 9 times out of 10, it comes down to sloppy prep work. So let's do this right. Start by cutting your 1/2-inch copper pipe with a tube cutter. Don't use a hacksaw if you can help it. A hacksaw leaves a rough, angled cut, and that creates problems for both connection types. With your tube cutter, tighten it just a quarter turn at a time as you rotate around the pipe. Nice and easy. You'll get a perfectly square cut every time. Once you've made your cut, flip the tube cutter over and use the built-in reamer to clean out the burr on the inside edge. That little ridge of copper left from cutting might seem harmless, but on a SharkBite fitting, it can slice right through that O-ring and give you a slow leak. On a soldered joint, it creates turbulence that can cause erosion over time. So always deburr. Next, take your emery cloth and sand the outside of the pipe for about 1.5 inches back from the end. You want to see bright, shiny copper with no oxidation, no fingerprints, nothing. For the solder joint, this is critical because solder won't bond to dirty or oxidized copper. For the SharkBite, a clean surface helps the O-ring seal properly and lets the grab ring bite evenly. Finally, mark your insertion depth. For a 1/2 inch SharkBite fitting, your pipe needs to go in exactly 1 inch. Use your depth gauge or measure 1 inch from the end and make a clear mark with a permanent marker. For the solder joint, dry fit the coupling onto the pipe and mark where it stops. That way you know exactly how deep to apply your flux. By the way, if you're finding this advice helpful, you should know it's just a small sample of what I've put into my new guide, the Ultimate Plumbing Playbook. It's packed with step-by-step instructions for hundreds of repairs that can save you thousands. To grab your copy, you can scan the QR code on the screen right now, or just use the first link in the description below. All right, let's continue. Let's make the SharkBite connection first, since it's the simpler of the two. Take your prepared pipe with the depth mark on it, hold the SharkBite coupling in one hand, and push the pipe straight in with a firm, steady motion. Don't twist it, don't wiggle it, just push it straight until you feel it stop, and that mark you made should be right at the edge of the fitting. Here's where most people go wrong. They don't push hard enough. That grab ring inside has real resistance to it, especially the first time. You need to push firmly past that ring until the pipe is fully seated. If your mark is still visible and sitting away from the fitting, the pipe isn't in far enough. Push harder. I've seen homeowners think the fitting was on, turn the water back on, and get sprayed in the face because the pipe was 1/4 inch short. Give it a gentle tug to make sure the grab ring has engaged. It should feel completely locked in place. You shouldn't be able to pull it apart with your hands. If it slides off, something went wrong with your prep or you didn't push it in deep enough. That's it for the SharkBite side. Took about 10 seconds once the pipe was prepped. Now let's make the soldered connection, and I'll walk you through this carefully because proper soldering technique is a skill every homeowner should have. Start by applying a thin, even layer of flux to the outside of your copper pipe where it will sit inside the fitting. Then apply a thin layer of flux inside the coupling as well. You don't need a ton. A nice, even coat is all it takes. The flux serves two purposes. It keeps the copper from oxidizing when you apply heat, and it helps draw the molten solder into the joint by capillary action. Slide the coupling onto the pipe and give it a slight twist to spread the flux evenly. Now light your propane torch and adjust it to a steady blue flame. You want the tip of the inner blue cone. That's where the heat is hottest. Apply heat to the middle of the fitting, not directly on the joint where the pipe meets the coupling. The idea is to heat the fitting so it draws the solder in, not to heat the solder directly. After about 15 to 20 seconds on half-inch copper, touch your solder to the joint on the opposite side from the flame. If the fitting is hot enough, the solder will melt instantly and get sucked right into the gap. You'll see a bright silver ring form all the way around the joint. That's what a perfect soldered connection looks like. You should use about 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch of solder for a 1/2 inch joint. If solder is dripping and balling up on the outside, your fitting is too hot. If it won't melt, give it a few more seconds of heat. Pull the flame away, let it cool for a minute, and wipe the joint with a damp rag while it's still warm. This gives you a clean, professional-looking joint and removes excess flux that could turn green over time. Now, for the moment of truth. I've got both connections built into identical test assemblies, each capped on one end with a pressure gauge and a ball valve on the other, connected to my hand pump. I filled both assemblies with water, bled out the air, and I'm going to start cranking up the pressure. At 60 psi, which is typical household water pressure, both connections are bone dry. No surprise there. At 80 psi, which is on the higher end of what you'd see in a residential system, still nothing. Both holding perfectly. I brought them up to 150 psi, which is the standard code test pressure for residential plumbing. Both joints are rock solid. No weeping, no drips, no movement at all. Now we're getting into territory way beyond what your home plumbing would ever see. At 200 psi, both still holding. At 250 psi, still nothing. I kept cranking. At 300 psi, which is nearly 4 times normal household pressure, still no failure on either connection. The SharkBite fitting started showing its first signs of stress right around 350 psi. I could see the pipe wanting to creep back slightly in the grab ring. The soldered joint showed no visible change at all. The SharkBite connection finally blew off at right around 400 psi. The pipe pulled out of the grab ring. The soldered joint held all the way up to over 500 psi before the copper pipe itself actually split. The solder joint never failed. The pipe gave out first. So what does this actually mean for you at home? Here's the honest truth. Both connections are far stronger than anything your household water pressure will ever throw at them. Your home system typically runs between 40 and 80 psi. Both methods held well over 300 before showing any stress at all. That's a massive safety margin either way. Where soldered joints have the real advantages, longevity and heat tolerance. A properly soldered joint can last the lifetime of your home. SharkBite fittings have O-rings, and rubber degrades over time, especially in hot water lines. SharkBite rates their fittings for a 25-year lifespan, which is great. But a soldered joint doesn't have that clock ticking. If you're doing permanent work inside walls or underground, solder is still the way to go. SharkBite is fantastic for accessible areas, repairs, and situations where speed matters. Let's talk about some common problems you might run into with each method and how to solve them. With SharkBite fittings, the number one issue is a slow drip right after installation. This almost always means the pipe wasn't pushed in deep enough, or there's a scratch on the pipe that's letting water seep past the O-ring. The fix is to disconnect the fitting using the release clip, inspect the pipe for burrs or scratches, sand it smooth, remark your depth, and push it back on, making sure it's fully seated. The second common shark bite problem is using them on pipe that isn't compatible. SharkBite fittings work on copper, CPVC, and PEX, but they do not work on galvanized steel, and they don't work well on copper that's heavily corroded or pitted. If your existing copper is rough and green, you need to cut back to clean pipe before connecting. With soldered joints, the most common problem is a cold joint. That's when the fitting wasn't hot enough, and the solder just sat on the surface instead of flowing into the gap. You'll see dull, lumpy solder on the outside, and the joint will leak under pressure. The fix is to drain the line, reheat the joint, and add fresh flux and solder. Sometimes you need to take it apart completely and start over. Another soldering issue is pinholes from overheating. If you hold the torch on too long, you can burn the flux and create tiny voids in the solder. These show up as small drips that only appear under pressure. The fix is to drain, clean, reflux, and resolder with less heat and quicker timing. Prevention is simple. Heat the fitting just until solder flows. Then remove the flame immediately. Now, for that bonus tip I promised you at the beginning. Here's when SharkBite is actually the smarter choice, even if you're a confident solderer. Anytime you're working on a line that you cannot get completely dry, reach for a SharkBite. Even a tiny trickle of water inside a copper pipe will prevent solder from bonding properly. I've watched experienced plumbers spend 45 minutes stuffing bread into pipes trying to dam up a slow drip just so they could solder a joint. A SharkBite fitting doesn't care if the pipe is wet. Push it on and it seals. For emergency repairs, for that one joint under the slab where you can't stop the trickle, or for that tight spot behind the water heater where you can't safely use a torch, SharkBite isn't a compromise. It's the right tool for the job. I keep a handful of them in my truck at all times for exactly those situations. Before you go, I want to make sure you know about my complete guide, the Ultimate Plumbing Playbook. It goes way deeper than we can in a single video, with 85 pages covering everything from clearing any clog to replacing your own water heater. If you want to stop wasting money on simple fixes, this book is for you. Just scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description to get your copy. Thanks for watching. And if you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. I'll see you in the next video.